If you look at the skyline of Ouagadougou today, you will not see many towers that reflect the true scale of the money moving through Burkina Faso. Gold leaves the country. Fuel flows through its markets. Telecommunications connect millions. Banks process hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet, the physical presence of many of these powerful economic actors remains surprisingly modest. So, here is the uncomfortable question: is this new policy about architecture? Or is it about power? The government of Burkina Faso has now required that large companies build their headquarters on national territory. Any company with an average annual turnover of at least 5 billion CFA francs over the last 3 years, roughly 8.8 million United States dollars, must comply. And for those with revenues of 100 billion CFA francs or more, approximately 176 to 179 million United States dollars, the obligation is clear: they must construct a headquarters building of at least 7 floors above ground, with underground and surface parking, and with energy efficiency standards. This is not just a construction guideline. It is the operational arm of a law. Companies have 6 months to submit building plans and up to 36 months to complete construction after approval. But beneath the legal language lies something deeper. This is a strategic move, a test of economic sovereignty, a signal that under Captain Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso is redefining what it means for capital to operate inside its borders. In this video, we are not just examining buildings, we are examining control, responsibility, symbolism, and the future shape of economic power in the Sahel. To understand why this policy matters, we need to step back and look at the structure of Burkina Faso's economy. Burkina Faso's gross domestic product stands at roughly 23 billion United States dollars. In recent years, growth has hovered around 4 to 5%, driven largely by gold mining, agriculture, telecommunications, banking, and energy distribution. A relatively small number of large companies generate a disproportionate share of national revenue. Gold mining alone represents a major pillar of exports. Fuel importation and distribution companies manage the lifeblood of transportation and industry. Telecommunications firms connect millions of citizens and businesses. Banks control credit, savings, and financial flows that shape everyday economic activity. In other words, while the country's overall economy may appear modest by global standards, certain corporations operating within it manage revenues reaching or exceeding 100 billion CFA francs, roughly 176 to 179 million United States dollars. Yet, historically, some of these companies have operated with limited physical and symbolic presence. Offices may exist, but not always headquarters that reflect the scale of their operations. Decision-making structures can be regional. Financial reporting chains may extend beyond national borders. That raises a structural question. If the largest economic actors in a country do not fully anchor themselves physically and administratively inside that country, how much control does the state truly exercise over them? This new requirement to build headquarters is not emerging in a vacuum. It comes at a time when Burkina Faso is redefining its governance model, strengthening central authority, and attempting to reclaim economic leverage. Before judging the policy, we must first understand the imbalance it seeks to correct. The skyline is not just about buildings. It is a visible indicator of where power sits, and who ultimately answers to whom. Now, let us examine the law itself, because the details matter. The government has set a clear financial threshold. Any company with an average turnover of at least 5 billion CFA francs over the last 3 fiscal years, approximately 8.8 million United States dollars, must establish its headquarters on national territory. This is not optional. It is mandatory. Companies have 6 months from the adoption of the law to submit a construction file to an interministerial commission. That commission reviews compliance with all technical and administrative requirements. Once the file is validated, the company has a maximum of 36 months to complete construction. But the most strategic element lies in the classification system. Companies are divided into 4 categories based on revenue. Category A includes firms with turnover equal to or greater than 100 billion CFA francs, roughly 176 to 179 million United States dollars. These companies must build a structure of at least 7 floors above ground, with both underground and surface parking, and with energy efficiency standards integrated into the design. Category B, between 50 and 100 billion CFA francs, must build at least 5 floors. Category C, between 10 and 50 billion CFA francs, must build at least 4 floors. Category D, below 10 billion CFA francs but still above the 5 billion threshold, must build at least 3 floors. At first glance, this may appear purely architectural, but building height here functions as a proxy for economic weight. The state is essentially saying your physical footprint must match your financial footprint. That is not a technical regulation. That is a statement of authority. Now, let us focus on the most powerful tier, the companies generating 100 billion CFA francs or more in annual turnover, roughly 176 to 179 million United States dollars. These are not small players. These are the economic engines of Burkina Faso. They are often active in gold mining, fuel importation and distribution, telecommunications, electricity, banking, and large-scale commerce. They influence employment, supply chains, public revenue, and in some cases even political stability. When the state tells this category that they must construct a headquarters of at least 7 floors above ground with underground parking, surface parking, and energy efficiency standards, it is doing something more than regulating office space. It is forcing permanence. A 7-story building is not temporary infrastructure. It is not a rented office that can be relocated quietly. It is capital anchored in concrete and steel. It signals long-term commitment. It increases sunk costs. It makes exit more difficult. This is where the policy becomes strategic. For years, many African economies have struggled with a structural imbalance. Companies extract value, generate revenue, and sometimes transfer profits outward, while maintaining limited physical and symbolic attachment to the territory itself. By demanding a visible, regulated, and energy-compliant headquarters. The state is effectively saying if you operate at the highest level in this country, you must reflect that level physically and legally within it. Height becomes hierarchy. 7 floors are not just 7 floors. They are a declaration that economic power must be accountable to national space. And that changes the psychology of both the corporation and the state. Beyond symbolism and corporate psychology, this policy carries significant implications for urban development and national infrastructure. When multiple large corporations are required to construct multi-story headquarters within a defined time frame, the impact goes far beyond office walls. It activates an entire economic chain. First, there is land acquisition. State agencies such as the National Land Development Authority make plots available specifically for these projects. That immediately increases the strategic importance of certain urban zones, particularly in Ouagadougou and potentially Bobo-Dioulasso. Second, construction demand rises. Architects, engineers, contractors, cement suppliers, steel manufacturers, electricians, and energy specialists all become part of the equation. A single 7-story structure represents millions of dollars in local contracts, wages, and materials. Third, there is the question of energy efficiency. The decree does not simply require height, it also integrates performance standards. That means modern insulation, efficient lighting, climate control systems, and potentially solar integration. Over time, this raises the technical level of the domestic construction sector. Fourth, clusters begin to form. When major companies build in proximity, financial districts naturally emerge. Restaurants, service providers, security firms, maintenance companies, and transportation networks follow. Urban space reorganizes itself around economic gravity. For a country seeking stronger internal economic circulation, this matters. Instead of capital merely passing through accounts, part of it is converted into physical assets on national soil. Instead of temporary commercial presence, there is durable infrastructure. Of course, this transformation requires coordination. Permits must move quickly. Utilities must keep pace. Roads must handle increased traffic. But if managed effectively, what begins as a regulatory decree could evolve into a structural reshaping of Burkina Faso's economic landscape. Concrete, in this case, becomes policy made visible. To fully understand this policy, we must place it within the leadership style and strategic direction of Captain Ibrahim Traore. Since taking power, Traore has consistently framed his governance around sovereignty, national dignity, and reduced dependence on external control. His messaging has emphasized reclaiming economic leverage, strengthening state authority, and ensuring that national resources translate into visible national development. The headquarters decree fits squarely into that framework. First, it reinforces the idea that economic power must be accountable to the state. Companies operating at scale inside Burkina Faso are no longer distant financial entities. They must physically root themselves within the territory. Second, it signals that the government is willing to set clear rules rather than rely solely on negotiation or incentives. Instead of asking corporations to voluntarily increase their local footprint, the state establishes an obligation backed by timelines and administrative oversight. Third, it creates visible symbols of economic transformation. Large headquarters buildings rising in the capital are not only corporate spaces, they become architectural statements that economic actors are integrated into the national project. For Traore, this carries political value. Supporters can point to concrete change, literally. Towers under construction demonstrate action, not rhetoric. However, this approach also carries risk. Strong leadership that moves decisively must ensure implementation capacity matches ambition. If permits stall, land allocation becomes politicized, or deadlines are ignored. Credibility could suffer. In that sense, this decree is more than a regulatory measure. It is a test of administrative strength under Traore's leadership. Success would reinforce the narrative of economic sovereignty. Failure would expose institutional weakness. The stakes are therefore political as much as economic. No major economic reform unfolds without resistance, especially when it directly affects powerful corporate actors, including Western companies operating in Burkina Faso, for firms headquartered in Europe or North America. Regulatory predictability is critical. When new obligations appear, particularly those requiring significant capital expenditure, internal risk assessments immediately follow. Building a 7-story headquarters with underground parking and energy compliance standards is not a minor adjustment. It represents millions of dollars in fixed investment. Some companies may quietly calculate whether expanding operations still makes financial sense under the new framework. Others may seek clarifications, extensions, or technical adjustments through legal and diplomatic channels. Industry associations may raise concerns about implementation speed, transparency of land allocation, or consistency in enforcement. There is also a psychological dimension. When a government signals stronger control over economic actors, foreign investors may interpret it as a shift toward tighter regulation more broadly. Even if the policy aims at accountability and development, perception matters in global capital markets. However, there are limits to how far resistance can go. Companies generating 100 billion CFA francs or more in revenue, approximately 176 to 179 million United States dollars, are deeply embedded in the local economy. They rely on licenses, infrastructure, workforce, and long-term contracts. Exiting abruptly is rarely practical. More likely than withdrawal is negotiation and adaptation. In this sense, the policy becomes a balancing act. The government must enforce standards firmly enough to maintain credibility, yet flexibly enough to avoid triggering capital flight or investment freezes. The real outcome will depend not on the decree itself, but on how it is implemented in practice. To better understand the broader implications of this decree, we should compare it with approaches taken by other African countries. Take Rwanda as an example. Rwanda has built a reputation for attracting corporate headquarters through incentives, regulatory clarity, and streamlined administrative processes, instead of imposing strict construction obligations. It often creates an environment where companies choose to base regional offices there because it offers efficiency, stability, and tax advantages. In that model, the state competes for headquarters by lowering friction. Burkina Faso is taking a different route. Rather than competing for voluntary relocation, it is asserting regulatory authority over companies already operating within its borders. It is saying if you generate significant revenue here, your presence must be proportionate to that revenue. This reflects two distinct philosophies of state power. One model emphasizes attraction through incentives. The other emphasizes alignment through obligation. Neither approach is inherently right or wrong. The success of either depends on execution and context. Rwanda operates in a relatively stable environment with strong administrative capacity and an international branding strategy. Burkina Faso operates in a more fragile security context, where consolidating state authority may take priority over competing in a global headquarters race. For other African nations, the lesson is not simply to copy one model or the other. The deeper lesson is about coherence. If a country declares economic sovereignty as a strategic goal, its policies must consistently reinforce that goal. But sovereignty without administrative efficiency can discourage investment, and investment without accountability can weaken sovereignty. The balance is delicate. Burkina Faso's decree therefore becomes a case study. It forces the continent to confront a central question. How can African states demand more responsibility from large corporations without isolating themselves from global capital? Even with strong political messaging and clear regulatory language, the real test of this decree lies in execution and long-term consequences. There are several possible future scenarios. The first is full implementation and visible transformation. In this scenario, major corporations comply within the 36-month window. Construction cranes become part of the skyline. Financial districts begin to form. The state demonstrates that it can set rules and enforce them consistently. This outcome would strengthen the narrative of economic sovereignty and administrative capacity. The second scenario is partial compliance. Some companies move quickly, especially those seeking favorable relations with the government. Others delay, negotiate, or request technical exemptions. Buildings rise, but unevenly. The policy exists, yet its impact remains fragmented. This outcome would neither fully succeed nor completely fail. The third scenario involves economic pushback. If external investors interpret the measure as a sign of increasing regulatory unpredictability, new investment could slow. Companies might reduce expansion plans or shift regional strategies, even without formal resistance. Capital flows can quietly adjust. Each path carries consequences. For citizens, visible construction could signal progress and national assertion. For the government, It could validate a model of assertive economic governance. For investors, it would either confirm stability or raise caution, depending on how transparently and fairly the rules are applied. Ultimately, the decree forces a deeper reflection. Economic sovereignty is not a slogan. It requires institutions capable of monitoring, enforcing, and coordinating complex projects. It requires courts, planning agencies, financial regulators, and technical inspectors that function efficiently. Without that infrastructure, even the strongest decree remains ink on paper. With it, concrete becomes credibility. If we step back and summarize what this decree really represents, 4 strategic moves become clear. First, the government is forcing physical presence. Large corporations operating in Burkina Faso must anchor themselves in national territory through permanent infrastructure. Economic activity can no longer remain abstract or distant. It must occupy space. Second, the state is standardizing visibility. By linking building height to revenue, it aligns corporate scale with architectural scale. The more you earn, the more visible you must become. In doing so, the state transforms concrete and steel into instruments of accountability. Third, it strengthens regulatory leverage. A company that has invested millions of dollars into a 7-story headquarters is less likely to disengage abruptly. Fixed assets increase interdependence between corporation and country. Fourth, it sends a message beyond borders. Burkina Faso is signaling that economic participation requires structured commitment. Profit and responsibility must move together. So the question becomes larger than buildings. Is this economic nationalism, or is it necessary sovereignty? Is it overreach, or is it overdue alignment between capital and country? There is no simple answer. The effectiveness of this strategy will depend on fairness, transparency, and administrative competence. If implemented consistently, it could reshape the economic landscape and strengthen national confidence. If mishandled, it could generate hesitation and uncertainty. But one truth remains. Africa is not merely a stage where external actors write the script. Increasingly, countries are experimenting with ways to redefine the terms of engagement. Burkina Faso's headquarters decree is one such experiment. The skyline will reveal whether it succeeds. I am here to analyze the structure behind the headlines. And if you are still watching, you are not here for surface-level news. You are here to understand power. What do you believe is the acceptable price for economic independence?